Brabazon. I'm the Dean of Graduate Research and the Professor of Cultural Studies at Flinders University. And welcome to this week's podcast on regional education. And this is quite timely for me because I'm just about to pack my case as I'm about to once more go to the Flinders University Alice Springs campus. Alice Springs is a fantastic place right in the middle of this great continent, and it's always a joy to go there, a joy to see and work with colleagues, and just fantastic to see our students. So I thought it was timely that we ponder, that we reflect on the nature of regional education. And as I said we, because once more I'm joined by Professor Steve Redhead, Professor of Cultural Studies, yes, the Senior Professor of Cultural Studies. And it is important, I think, that we dialogue about this because Steve and I, in very different ways, in very different continents, have committed to regional education. And I think it's important that we talk about this because, let's be frank, podcast listeners, the world is going quite mad at the moment and we lose a focus on what is important and the places and the spaces that are important. So let's reclaim a little bit of importance, a little bit of what is urgent, what is significant, rather than what some president appears to be doing in random tweets. So good morning, Steve.
Good morning.
And Steve, I want to talk about regional education. You and I have committed to it. And why have we done that? What are the strengths of regional education for both academic staff and also, say, professional staff as well, and for our students?
Well, I think firstly, we certainly have committed to it, and we've worked in universities over the last 20 years where we together have been committed to regional education, regional university education. But I think in that 20 years also, the new technologies have they've basically allowed regional education to be much more important if you wanted it to be. So, for example, in our PhD supervisions, we do quite a lot of our PhD supervisions by Skype.
Yes.
And we have done over the last few years. And that has meant that our students in the regions and on regional campuses have actually got just as much attention in that PhD supervision as students on campus in the city centres.
That's right. So synchronous supervision, it's digital, it's enabled synchronous communication via digital means, but it is still a weekly meeting. So
yes,
exactly the same way as we supervise in our offices, we actually supervise these students.
Yes. So I think it's a matter of a political will to commit, political and personal, will to commit to the regions. And I do think that there's all sorts of benefits for the regions. I mean, I was, until relatively recently, when the National Rural Law and Justice Alliance has really ground to a halt, that organisation, which I worked in as council member, actually was extremely committed to legal teaching, legal studies teaching, for example, in the regions, and the effects of research into rural law and justice and so on. And I think from that you can see how important it is politically in Australia, for example.
Yes.
But I think it's actually an international issue.
Yeah, look, it is, and there's so much that's important out in the regions, whether we're dealing with regional sport,
Yep.
which is crucial,
Yep.
regional music, for example.
Yep.
I was the chairman of the Mitchell Conservatorium as part of one of the regional conservatoria, so music
Absolutely.
is incredibly important in these regions. But I also wanted to specify the great gift that professional staff give our universities in
Yes.
these regional areas. We have the great gift of these brilliant women, frequently, and great men, that are in these regions,
Yes.
and of course they work in a university. There aren't as many employing options in these regions, and these fantastic women work in a university, perhaps paid less than they would be in a city centre, but gain from the flexibility that a university gives them, particularly with caring and family responsibilities.
Yeah, very much so. And we've met a lot of those people.
Absolutely, and a big hello to Janine McCarthy and Julie Ann Shaddig. Fantastic women, but we've made fantastic friends around the world in these regions, both in Australia and in Canada,
as well, yeah.
and in the United Kingdom. I also wanted to talk about for staff, particularly early career researchers and also people trying to get on that these regional universities can really help you do that.
Yes.
You can gain your first job
Yes.
in these regional universities, but also for staff that are wanting promotion.
Yeah.
If you're wanting to become an associate professor or a reader in the British system, or indeed a professor, you can move to a regional university and gain that opportunity that may not be available in the global cities. And also just in terms of building up your CV.
Yes.
In a regional university, you get an opportunity to do all sorts of tasks that you would never get an opportunity to do in second-tier city universities or global universities. Do you agree with that?
I do, and I think the important thing there is that it may be that as a member of staff trying to develop your own career, you eventually go to these places and then you move on.
Yes.
But I think in the time that you're there, it should be an important part of your learning and development in a lot of ways. It shouldn't be just somewhere you're passing through. Because our experience of a lot of those regional universities is that they're great places to work. And you would argue that.
Yes.
The trouble is that politically now, in all countries, the cities, the urban is becoming so important. You can see it in Australia, that the regional is being left behind. And that, certainly for universities, is a real problem.
Look, it is. And I'll just give one personal example if I can. My second full-time academic job was at CQU, Central Queensland University in Viva Rock Vegas, Rockhampton. And I was a little A-level lecturer, a little A-level bunny lecturer, but the dean, the wonderful Wally Woods, who is still a friend, he just retired last year, Wally Woods, I could deal directly with the dean. How fantastic was that as an A-level lecturer? And he supported my career. And I remember he put me on the CQU task force for regional education to make sure that the education that existed in Emerald was somewhat equivalent to Bundaberg, was somewhat equivalent to Gladstone and to Viva Rock Vegas. And I learnt so much from that man and the opportunities I gained early on in my career. I mean, basically, everything I learned at CQU, I'm still thinking in and through those issues. So what I would say to early career academics is never hesitate. Go to these places because you'll have a wild, fantastic time.
Yes, very much so.
Fantastic. So that's the strength of it. Let's get to the challenges. And you've already suggested there are some problems, particularly at the moment, economically, socially and politically with regional education. What do you see as happening, Steve?
Well, I think that there's a more general reinforcement of hierarchy in universities actually going on, so that the elite universities are really ring-fencing themselves in a way that actually I haven't seen for 20, 30 years.
No.
So there's a real issue there going on, as if other universities outside the elite are not important. Well, that's just nonsense.
Yes.
And it's a real political mistake if that is the route we're going down. But I think the urban regional is a major hierarchical difference.
Yes.
And what has to happen, I think you have to certainly develop the new technologies in a way that students in the regions aren't losing out.
So create a culture of equivalence, as I call it.
Very much so. And that can be done.
Yeah.
That is absolutely on the agenda, in my view, particularly with PhD supervision, PhD teaching and so on. But I think there is a more general political issue there that the regions and regional development, in whatever economic form, whether it's universities or arts centres or whatever, it's actually got to be organised around that political issue. And I think that universities in the regions play a major economic and political role, and we have to really assert that.
And Steve, I think you're absolutely right. This is an infrastructural question. Because if you live and work in the regions, you see the inequality, nay, injustice in healthcare.
Yes.
You see the inequality and injustice in school-based education, early years care. You live and you see it. So it makes it very difficult for families to be there. I mean, in some regional centres, let alone remote centres, it is difficult to see a doctor. So those challenges are incredibly significant, I think. And working in a university, that's important because they're often under-financed. And, there is a disrespect of the students that emerge from those universities, and there is a disrespect of the staff that emerge from those universities. I remember a really great friend of ours, and I will name Jackie because Jackie is a great friend of ours. Jackie made a point that when she was applying for one of her other jobs post CQU, that they said, well, you really have no right to be here because you've come from CQU, so, you've got no right to actually be even applying for this job. So how dare you ask for a pay increase? And it's that sort of disrespect. It's like, these are decent, hard-working, brilliant people doing it pretty tough and trying to really enable education in this country. Yeah. And I think the disrespect of that is startling. And look, let's talk about the region itself. We've mentioned a bit about universities as a workforce and great for students. But what is the benefit of a university to a region? And you can go economically, socially, politically.
Well, I think economically it can be absolutely central. I mean, we worked at Charles Sturt University, for example, for quite a few years. And, say, the Bathurst area, which is where we actually lived, which is one of the campuses, there was hardly any other major employer by the time we left. No. There was a lot of manufacturing closing down. And I really think you have to build... I mean, you've argued about it in your sort of concept of university cities.
Yes.
And I think and you've done a lot of work on that. I think there is a literature around this politics, and it's not just sort of pie in the sky. It really can be an important regional economic development, and I certainly think socially and culturally built on that.
Yes, so it provides a workforce, it provides people going to the shops, it provides an infrastructure, and certainly I know, as someone who worked at the University of Bolton, a lot of people have abused that particular university, and that's part of, in fact, what we're talking about today. That university was integral to that large town. Absolutely integral as an
Great
employer. And we always used to stand in our buildings and look out of the window. And it was one of the few universities in the world, I would argue, that when you looked out of the window, you would see all the houses, you would see the community from where your students are derived.
Yes.
So looking out the window, that's how embedded that community was with that university.
Yes, but I mean, someone like you has a major commitment to it, and I think, and you've shown it in your own professional work, the fact that you're going to Alice Springs this week, for instance, where other staff are not necessarily going to these regions, that you have to put your job on the line in a lot of ways in these areas. And I think that's one of the important things that staff can do. See it as a major part of your professional development.
Yes, and I think that commitment of time, that commitment to sit with someone in their location is crucial. And certainly, when I ran the large School of Teacher Education with a campus in Burlington in Canada for a period, but also my wonderful campus in Dubbo, then I made a commitment, and I did it from the time I started till the time I finished, going to Dubbo once a fortnight on the train, so there'd be very little cost to the Australian taxpayer on the train, stay there, and so I can commit to that. And so the staff didn't have to, magically, grab their head of school because they'd only ever get to see them once every 6 months. It's like once a fortnight I would arrive, and so there was no stress, it was all predictable, and it performed the commitment that this Outlier campus was part of what we did in that school. Yeah,
so I think, especially in Australia, but this is an international issue, if you leave behind the regional universities, you're going to have a much poorer university system overall. You can be as elitist as you like, but you will lose if you don't develop the regions.
Yeah, and I'm certainly incredibly proud that Flinders University commits to the territory.
Yeah,
to the
really
Northern
important.
Territory. For our international listeners to this podcast, you might like to put the Northern Territory into your Google search and see exactly where it is. It's a wonderful place, incredibly wild, fabulous place. And we have two campuses. We have a campus at Alice Springs. We also have a campus in Darwin. And I think it is important, to be frank with you, that the Dean of Graduate Research, the person that actually instructs and looks after our PhD students and research master students, commits to Alice Springs and to Darwin.
Yeah, symbolically, that's really important.
Yeah. And important for those students, because those students matter as much as the urbane students living in Adelaide.
Yeah.
They are just as significant.
Yeah.
And therefore, I want to also talk about the Outlier University. So this is, for example, like at Flinders University, we have a campus at Bedford Park, which is our major campus. We also have a campus at the wonderful Sturt, where all the health sciences are, and nursing, midwifery, and fabulous Tonsley, which is tremendous for many of our science and engineering students. But it's all clustered in a very precise area. But then we do have these campuses in Alice Springs and in Darwin, which is in another state, and Australia is a really big place. But for example, Steve, you worked at MMU for decades with the wonderful campus and our wonderful colleagues out at Crewe. I did some work out at Crewe as well, and Dubbo for CSU. So how does it operate when you've got, if you will, the urban, second-tier urban campuses with the outliers that are often in third-tier cities?
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly in my experience at Manchester Metropolitan University, where Crewe and Alsager campuses of what was Crewe and Alsager College at one time became part of Manchester Metropolitan University. You know, you were driving 40 miles, basically, if you were living in the city centre of Manchester, to go and teach at Crewe or to research at Crewe. And a lot of the sport development stuff, which is very important at MMU, was and still is actually out at Crewe and Alsager. So it means staff have to commit themselves, to doing a lot of travelling, in fact, for a start. They have to want to be committed to those outlier campuses. But I think they can be also very important as part of the development of the regions. You know, Crewe's a great example. It's a railway town 40 miles from Manchester, but actually it has its own sort of instinctive development. And the sporting part of MMU, which is out there, is a really important part of the academic community at MMU. So that it shows what can be done.
But I also remember I was brought in as an external assessor
you
for
were.
a new degree.
Yes, you were in that faculty, which was the Crewe faculty.
Was I down in Brighton when I was brought in for that?
Yeah.
I think I was.
Yeah, you were.
But I always
came with
remember I dug in very deeply there. Yep. Remember, they were wonderful staff. I was so impressed. It was a fantastic degree. But it was very, very clear that the research trajectory, the research career of the staff was being neglected.
Yes.
And no one seemed to care.
Yes. So and you were able to influence that.
Well, they brought in a bright young thing, bless, who thought they were going to railroad this new degree through at Crewe. And I said, look, I'm not going to sign this off until we have a research plan for the staff that are involved here. Yeah. And I always remember the staff afterwards, after the event was over and that was guaranteed and organised and signed off, they came up to me afterwards and said, I'm so grateful you did that, because nobody would have done anything for our research career if you hadn't done that, because it was a teaching factory. So some of these outlier campuses are used a bit as teaching fodder.
Yes, and it's a good example, is that, to show that actually you shouldn't downgrade them in any way. No. And the staff working in those campuses should be very aware of that. They should, defend both research and teaching.
Absolutely, it's very important. And that's why I think it's important. And I know my wonderful boss, Rob Saint, and I were very focused on the territory. It means a great deal to us. And it's about finding strategies to commit deeply to research in these areas.
Exactly.
As much as
the academic research should be of those places.
And it's so important. I mean, if you're in Alice Springs, if you're in Darwin, the projects that you can do there about sport, about music, about regional development, is just startling. And I think we need to really be focusing on what, the gift, the research gift that comes from these regions.
And at Charles Sturt University, we had a Creative Regions Lab. Which was meant to develop that, both in terms of research and teaching. So, there's a lot of academic things you can do in order to strengthen regional universities. Yeah,
and the final question, therefore, is perhaps the pessimistic one. And it's pessimistic because of these times we're living in, Steve, that it seems to me what's important is starting to be lost for these sort of endless tweet tirades and nonsense that's occurring at the moment. So what do we lose in a country like Australia? What do we lose if we lose that commitment to the regions, and particularly regional education? What is the cost of losing that commitment?
Well, I think it is a huge cost. I mean, I would say at all costs, really, don't change that shift in terms of regional and urban. I think that is going to happen. There's going to be an onslaught, because it's seen as an economic issue, bricks and mortar basically, and I think we have to defend regional education within universities which are urban and universities which are rural.
Yeah, and it's not simply that the university makes money. I think there's a very poor costing, very poor financial modelling is occurring around regional education
it's mistaken
at the moment, because they're focusing on, the student numbers aren't there. But actually, what would happen if you took that CSU campus out of Dubbo? You've got to think of the whole city, the whole region, the whole large town when you're thinking about the value of universities.
That's right, you are.